In this video, we're going to discuss the Progressive Era. It's a fascinating time in American history that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. The Progressive Era runs from about the turn of the century, about 1900 or so, until about, I would argue, about 1920, even 1921. Most scholars and history textbooks that I've read and consulted, and even more dense monographs on the subject, they tend to end the Progressive Era around the year 1917 when America enters World War I. I don't think this is the best place to end the Progressive Era. I think actually you should push the Progressive Era through World War I because I think in many ways Progressive Era values helped to motivate the United States to enter World War I. And then World War I, the urgency of the war, the need to mobilize the United States very quickly for this conflict, helped to get a lot of progressive legislation advanced. And then there were still some important pieces of progressive legislation and developments that happened even after World War I finished. So because of that, I'm going to push the Progressive Era into the 1920s. And I would also argue, too, that there's many important longue durée or long-term antecedents for the Progressive Era as well. So we'll begin this lecture by talking about some major figures of the Progressive Era, defining the movement, what it is, and how these major figures I'm going to mention are emblematic of progressivism at the turn of the century. We'll go over antecedents, things that are going to lead to the Progressive Era or even predict the arrival of this period in American history. We're going to go over some proto-Progressive Era movements in politics. People like the Populists are going to be discussed. The Bellamy Nationalist clubs are going to be discussed. And then we're going to talk about the Progressive Era in religion, specifically the Progressive Era in the social gospel. And then we're going to get into key Progressive Era legislation and Progressive Era politics, especially the politics of the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. They are the three Progressive Era presidents. And then we'll wrap up the video by talking about some of the legislation that they will advance and important Progressive Era developments that happened even after 1917. And on this slide, you can see an image of Ida Tarbell. She was a journalist, an investigative journalist, what you might call a muckraker. She had been from a fairly well-off oil-producing, oil-refining family, but her family's refinery was shut down by John D. Rockefeller during the Cleveland Massacre back in the 1870s, and she made it a goal of her life to investigate John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. And I think Tarbell is also an emblematic figure of the Progressive Era, particularly of Progressive Era reformers. And you'll get a sense of why throughout this lecture video. Here are some very famous Progressive Era leaders who I consider to be very impactful and very significant. On the left, we have Jane Addams. Addams was basically a social worker. She really, in many ways, is the founder of the social working profession that we know today. In 1889, she helped to found in Chicago, Illinois, the Hull House, Hull House, and it was a one-part education center, one-part living space, one-part community center that was designed to help the poor of Chicago gain job training, be able to socialize, and have upward mobility. And for immigrants, immigrant poor people that would come to Hull House, there would be a level of cultural assimilation that would take place. This education institution designed to help the poor would help to also assimilate immigrants. That was a Progressive Era value, assimilation of immigrants. Up next, we have William Jennings Bryan, who I've mentioned before in my video on the South. Bryan starts out as a populist politician, but eventually becomes a part of the Progressive Era. After Bryan, we have Eugene Debs, who I've talked about before. Debs was more of a radical, more of a socialist, but there was a radical fringe to the progressive movement. Not all progressives were socialists or political radicals, but there were some more radical people like Debs in the movement. Progressivism is a very big, very broad movement. It's a big tent, a very big tent, if you want to use political terms. I would argue it's a much bigger tent than modern 21st century progressivism is. In fact, in this period, you could even be a conservative and a progressive, believe it or not. Up next, we have Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's got a great mustache as well. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. had been a Civil War veteran. He was a big proponent of veterans issues, supported some more conservative issues, you might say. Conservatives can be progressives as well in this period in a way that I don't think would be possible in the present. And he, of course, is a Supreme Court justice and will support many progressive issues from the bench as well. Up next, we have Robert La Follette Sr. He was the governor of Wisconsin and then eventually senator for the state of Wisconsin. He represented the Republican Party, or rather, he was a part of the Republican Party and then represented his state. He was a very important progressive leader in state politics, and then will also support progressivism as a senator as well in Washington, D.C. And he's going to remain a progressive even after the progressive movement begins to collapse towards the end of the 1910s into the beginning of the 1920s. And the last figure we have on this slide, and he's often not talked about as much in the progressive era, is Al Smith. Al Smith was a Democratic Party politician from New York. Progressivism was a bipartisan movement. Again, it's a big tent. There were Democrats and Republicans that were progressives. Smith will eventually run for president in 1928, although he will lose to Herbert Hoover, but he was a part of the progressive movement during his youth. Again, progressive politics was very dominant in the 1900s and into the 1910s. And, of course, we have presidents. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive for the Republicans. William Howard Taft, a progressive for the Republicans. And then Woodrow Wilson, a progressive for the Democrats. And future U.S. presidents also spent some time in the progressive movement, most notably Herbert Hoover for the Republicans, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Both of these men had been progressives in their youth during the 1900s and 1910s. But we're going to talk more about Hoover and FDR in future videos when we get to the 1930s and the Great Depression. By the way, I should also add a couple more things about Jane Addams. Jane Addams would go on to help found the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, in 1920, and she also, we would consider her to be a part of the LGBT community today, but we'll talk a bit more about Addams's work and Hull House on a future slide. And by the way, Hull House, parts of it were open until the 1960s. Progressivism is a big, broad, and diverse movement. There are men and there are women in progressivism. There are Northerners and Southerners in progressivism. Teddy Roosevelt was a Northern man from New York. Woodrow Wilson was a Southern man from Virginia. There were Westerners like William Jennings Bryan, and then there, of course, were Easterners as well in the progressive movement. And there are also African Americans in the progressive movement. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, African American activists and educators, they were progressives as well. They supported a lot of progressive issues in their advocacy for African Americans. But again, progressivism is a very broad movement. Both Du Bois and Washington could be considered to be a part of the movement, even though Du Bois and Washington disagreed on many issues, especially when it came to political equality for African Americans versus racial uplift. But I do think they could be defined as progressives. Also, Ida B. Wells, the investigative journalist who we talked about in the transitional video between AMH 2010 and AMH 2020, she was a muckraking journalist in her own way, investigating lynchings in the South. I, too, would define her as a progressive. Here again is Ida B. Wells with her magnum opus, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And This is a work of investigative journalism, of muckraking, and Wells was also an educator as well. Education was very important to progressives, so I classify her as part of the progressive movement. Again, it's a very broad movement, and there often is disagreement sometimes in progressivism. Some progressives were very pro-African American rights, people like Wells and like Washington and like Du Bois, and even amongst white progressives who were advocating for more racial equality in America. But then you have progressives, bona fide progressives, who were also against African American racial equality, most notably President Woodrow Wilson, who was not just callous and not caring about African American issues, but was openly hostile to African Americans. Yet he can still be considered a progressive by the standards of the early 20th century progressive era. This is George Washington Carver, an African American educator, scientist, and inventor. He worked at the Tuskegee Institute for much of his career, and he was not as involved in African American political activism as much as Washington, Booker T. Washington, or W.E.B. Du Bois were involved. But he made some very important scientific discoveries and developed a variety of products, most notably products made from peanuts. Peanuts are a very useful crop. They can be grown in fields in between cotton crops to help bring nutrients back into the soil. And this is going to provide a better food source for poor people in the South, especially poor African Americans. And it's also going to be better for the soil and better for the environment as well, because cotton is notorious for sucking nutrients out of the soil. So he helped to develop very commercially viable products made from peanuts, most notably a peanut butter. Now, other scientists developed peanut butters before Carver, but Carver was the one that really demonstrated it could be a commercially viable product. And because of his focus on education and on helping people, I would consider him to be a part of the progressive movement. There were progressives that were very political, who were even politicians, and then there were progressives who were not as directly involved in politics, like George Washington Carver. So now we're going to move on to some longue durée or long-term antecedents of progressivism. And I'm going to define progressivism a little bit more because it is such a big, broad movement. You have to define yourself, especially when you're a very big tent kind of movement. And what did the progressives want? They wanted to reform society. They wanted to change society for the better, and they wanted to use several means. They wanted to use education, both their own educational training. Many progressives were teachers, scientists, doctors. This is the kind of class of people we're talking about here. They wanted to use their own education to fix social problems, and they also wanted to educate others because many of them were teachers and social workers and even college professors. Woodrow Wilson, U.S. president, was a college professor before he became president. As I said, some were more political, others were more apolitical. They also wanted to use the government as a means for positive social change. The government would promote education, the government would promote social programs, and the government would regulate the economy as well. While some progressives were a bit more radical, even socialistic, like a Eugene Debs, this was not the mainstream idea about the economy during the progressive era. Really what the progressives wanted was they wanted to reform the American economy. They wanted to close the wealth disparities that had emerged during the Gilded Age, with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. They wanted to help the poor. They wanted to have some wealth redistribution through taxation, especially income taxes. And they wanted to, in the language of the day, save capitalism from itself. They felt that having a system that was too much laissez-faire, too much of a hands-off U.S. government, was going to perpetuate wealth inequality and could potentially lead to revolutions, in a dangerous and unstable society. The progressives are the class of people. They're a lot of educated people. They tend to be very upper middle class kind of people, and also some old money, wealthier people like the Roosevelts. The Roosevelts being a fairly well-off old Dutch family in New York, and they were very concerned about the new money people, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, that they were doing things that they shouldn't with their money, and they wanted to save capitalism from itself, and they wanted to kind of control the two dangerous classes, the very, very wealthy and then the very, very poor. So that's kind of a bit of who the progressives are as a group of people and what kind of binds them together, because they're Democrats, they're Republicans, they're women, they're men, they're white, they're black, they're northern, they're southern, they're eastern, and they're western. So antecedents of progressivism. Americans, to some degree, have always been a reformist people. We've always been interested in making a better world, making a better society, and we've always been interested in progress. And I would argue this impulse goes all the way back to before the founding of the United States of America. It goes back to colonial times. The Puritans, the Puritans and the Pilgrims in New England, they're sitting on a hill thinking, this is the symbol of New England here. It features a Native American saying, come over and help us. Now, the Puritans' idea of progress may not be considered progress today, and Native Americans certainly would have had a very different idea about how much help they were receiving from the Puritan settlers. The American Revolution was a war for reform as well, reforming the American people's relationship with the British Empire, particularly when it came to things like taxation without representation. The Founding Fathers were very educated people. Many of them had college degrees, or they were self-taught, autodidacts. They were a very educated group of people, and they wanted to reform American society by declaring independence from Great Britain and by drafting the Constitution of the United States. You have religious movements, the Second Great Awakening. Progressivism can be very religious in the progressive era. They can also be secular as well, but the Second Great Awakening was a religious movement that happened in the late 1700s and really went on until after the War of 1812. And it really redefined American Christianity. It made it a lot more democratic, and also made American Christianity much more concerned with remedying social problems. Creating heaven on earth was a term that was often used, and even dealing with what you might call social justice issues. And the Second Great Awakening kind of leads into the antebellum reform movements. These are movements that develop in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, in the decades preceding the Civil War. Antebellum in American history generally means the years before the Civil War, antebellum. This can be seen in movements like the temperance movement, which sought to limit alcohol consumption. They generally were not thinking of banning alcohol completely in this period, just having Americans drink less or having them drink alcohol that wasn't as strong. Rather than drinking whiskey, drink beer instead, for example. Abolitionism was an antebellum reform movement seeking to end slavery. It's a reformist movement. It is a progressive movement, and I think it does help to inspire the progressivism of the turn of the century. Seneca Falls and the early women's movement as well that takes off in the late 1840s also is an antecedent to the progressivism we see at the turn of the century. And some of these movements, there's a cross-pollination of ideas between these movements. One could be a temperance advocate, as well as an abolitionist, and as well as a women's rights advocate as well. Certain leaders, people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth come to mind as kind of, in some cases, exchanging ideas between these movements. Again, these multiple movements, I think, kind of work to come together to kind of create the progressive movement that we have at the turn of the century. And the Civil War and Reconstruction are also reformist conflicts, reforming what to do about the Union and what to do about slavery, and how do we reconstruct the South and really reconstruct all of America to make it a more egalitarian society, a more economically productive society. The Civil War and Reconstruction both increased the size and scope of the U.S. federal government. They really helped to create a American administrative state, something that the progressives really worked to expand as well in the early 1900s. Things like the Morrill Act, which expanded college accessibility and college availability to Americans by setting up land-grant universities. This is going to make it more affordable for non-elite people to go to college. It also changes the focus of education as well. Education in colonial times was about sending a small group of elite people to go to schools like Harvard University, Yale University, where they would learn basically to be the future leaders of America. And many of these schools were often religious in nature as well, or religious education was a big part of the curriculum. The Morrill Act helped to make college education much more practical, much more about engineering, agricultural science, even military training, and the idea was this training was going to really directly deal with social problems America was facing in the 1800s. On a more negative side, the assimilationism of Native Americans, that is, the U.S. government's attempt to assimilate Native Americans to educate them in English and in Western culture, in American culture, and in industrial economic job training, often very forcefully. This could be considered to be sort of a antecedent of progressivism as well, because the progressives also wanted to assimilate immigrants coming into the country, to educate them, to train them to be good Americans, to speak English. There's even a cultural imperialist element to progressivism that makes it a really, I think, interesting movement. You may not agree with the progressives of the early 20th century, but they were looking to they were hoping to help people, but often through assimilationist, what we might call cultural imperialist means. So some other just explanations for why progressivism emerges when it does, and some of these are a bit more tenuous, but I think they're worth discussing. Some historians have suggested the focus on women's issues in progressivism, giving women the right to vote, and a more, you might say, parental or even paternalistic outlook on the relationship between government and the people. This may have been caused by increasing numbers of young people who grew up without fathers because their fathers died in the Civil War. And there might be something to that, although I think the timing for that is it's a bit too extended, because the Civil War is 1861 to 1865. People born in the 1850s who lost fathers during the American Civil War, they would be quite a bit older. They'd be in their 50s or even their 60s by the time the turn of the century progressive movement comes around. You might argue this was someone like Henry Grady, for example. Henry Grady was a progressive in a way. He gave his New South speech about the South and its being rebuilt as the New South, but he's a bit too early to really be considered a true member of the progressive movement. So I think the connection between loss of fathers and the Civil War, I think it's tenuous at best, but I thought I would mention it because I think it's interesting. I think what is definitely much more of a plausible accelerant of progressivism is the emerging managerial class that develops as a result of Gilded Age industrialization, and just there being more of a need for managers and professionals and what we might call experts today to kind of smooth out economic production, to smooth out the rough edges of capitalism, to kind of make the system work. And you really get this idea in a work called The Managerial Revolution by James Burnham. And increasing education access, increasing industrialization, it leads to basically a need for a managerial class to kind of keep the engine running smoothly, so to speak. And Burnham argued that you see it in capitalist societies like America, but you also see it in communist societies like the Soviet Union, and even in fascist societies as well. So the managerial class emerging as a result of Gilded Age industrialization and education and the Moral Act, I think, is probably a bigger explanation, along with all of the other antecedents I've mentioned. America's long-term interest in reformism, the reform movements of the early 1800s, they really, I think, in many ways come to fruition with the progressive era of the turn of the century period. In addition to long-term antecedents to progressivism, there are some more short-term or immediate antecedents that help to inspire progressivism. And one that I think is a really good example, and it's also kind of come into its own kind of new cultural moment lately, is Georgism. It comes from Henry George. He was an author who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And his family faced a lot of poverty in the kind of emerging Gilded Age period, having very little, if any, money, and really struggling hand to mouth. In some cases, having to basically beg for money from others to survive. And his experience prompted George to write really a massive tome, a large book about social progress in America and poverty in America in the sort of emerging Gilded Age period. And he proposed solutions like a land value tax. He thought that a land value tax would be able to fund the government, it would encourage economic development, it would make it easier for people to find things like housing, and it would just encourage better jobs for people through economic development. A land value tax is different than a property tax. A land value tax, as you can see from this diagram, is just a tax on the land itself. It's not a property tax like we have in the modern sense. Is a tax not only on the land but on any improvements you made to the land, your home, your farm, your factory, your apartment complex. And property taxes, a Georgist would argue, they will actually they will penalize economic development that would actually help regular people. So we should move more towards a land value tax. And this was a left-leaning ideology in the 1870s and 1880s. But interestingly enough, nowadays when I hear about Georgism, I often hear about it from more right-leaning or conservative-leaning people who want lower taxes because they want to pay taxes on the land that they own or live on, but they don't want to pay taxes on their home or on their business. So that's interesting to see how ideas change, their meaning changes over time based on the context. But George ran for mayor in 1886 in New York City. He didn't win, but he did a lot better than expected. He actually beat out the Republican candidate, none other than Teddy Roosevelt. So he did really well for a third party. The Democrats won, but he managed to beat the Republicans. So that's very interesting to see. There was some support for Henry George and his ideology of Georgism. This is another very important immediate antecedent to progressivism. These are the Bellamy Nationalist clubs, which I alluded to earlier in this video, and they centered around the work of an author named Edward Bellamy, shown here on this slide. And Bellamy wrote a book called Looking Backward, 2000, 1887. The book came out in the 1880s, and it was a futuristic science fiction utopian novel set in Boston in the year 2000. So it's the past for us. It's sort of a Rip Van Winkle type story where the protagonist falls asleep in the 1800s and he wakes up over a century later in a new version of Boston. It's very different from the one that he went to sleep in. In the future Boston, there's a nationalized economy. The future is socialist, according to Bellamy. There are extensive social programs and social safety nets. There are things like a social security system with retirement benefits. In some ways, Bellamy's future is true. There are certain things like social programs and social security today, and there are also some of the technologies that Bellamy predicts in his novel We Do Have Today. Things similar to the internet and similar to television, similar to credit cards, and even similar to big box stores like a Walmart, for example, exist in this future. However, Bellamy's proposed future was much more socialistic than the American economy that we have today, where our economy really is much more of what economists call a mixed economy, where it's a capitalist economy, but there are social programs. And many academics and the kind of people who class-wise will become progressives, they believe that socialism, the country was going to move in a more socialistic direction over time. Even if they were not radical socialist revolutionaries, they thought that this system of capitalism being more regulated, capitalism being kind of saved from itself, this is just going to emerge with time. And as I said, this novel was discussed in like book clubs called Bellamy Nationalist clubs. They called themselves nationalists because they were referencing nationalization, not nationalism like more of the political ideology, but nationalism is in nationalization. And they tended to be upper middle class and maybe even some upper class educated professional types. People who are really going to become either members or really direct supporters of the progressive movement. But again, the Bellamy Nationalist clubs are a interesting early or immediate antecedent of progressivism. But the biggest and most important immediate antecedent for progressivism, I would argue, was the Populists. And you see the Populists mentioned quite a bit more in scholarship as referencing inspiration for the progressive movement. So the Populists, they can trace their origins back to what were called the Grangers of the late 1860s. Granger is an old word for like a farmer who deals with livestock in particular, I've found. It's not a character from Harry Potter in this case. And farmers faced a lot of challenges in the late 1800s that I've gone over in my video on the American West. Homesteading often did not give large enough parcels of land to support these farming families, particularly farming families that were trying to survive in what was becoming an industrial capitalist economy, meaning that they are not just growing grain and raising livestock for their own use or to sell to their local community. They are um, they are growing agricultural products that they're going to sell as commodities. And when grain prices are up, they do well. When grain prices are down, they do poorly. But as the supply of grain, for example, increases, thanks to technology like heavier plows and reapers, of course, you're working harder with these new technologies. You're producing more, but you're getting paid in some cases less. And this is really a problem that a lot of farmers are facing. And really, rural American life is changing quite a bit in the late 1800s as the Gilded Age is emerging. The West is ceasing to be a frontier, it's being integrated, and rural Americans, they're beginning to live in almost like what some scholars call island communities. Now, not literal islands surrounded by water, but very insular communities. Yes, they're trading with the larger economy, but the thing that matters the most to you are the people right around you, and um, that can be stressful when this island community system is changing, it's evolving, it's even breaking down as communities and farmers are being further brought into this industrial capitalist economy as they're being much more productive now with these new technologies, but the prices on their grains are dropping, which lower food prices is good. It means people can have basic necessities, but it can be a real problem for farmers. And many farmers, in their attempts to keep up, they're buying new plows, they're buying new reapers, they're buying them on credit, and they're taking out mortgages against their land. And if they can't pay those debts back, if they have a bad harvest, if the prices drop, they could really be in trouble. Farmers are also developing new types of farming. They're developing dry farming to try to trap what little bit of moisture is in the soil. They'll use almost like mulch to kind of trap the moisture in the soil. They'll do things like planting winter wheat. What you'll do with winter wheat is you'll plant it in November, and then it will grow, or rather, it will remain in the soil, and then you'll harvest it early, like in late winter, early spring, and that can allow you to get an extra grain crop in the year. These are things that some of my family and ancestors did when they were farmers in the Midwest. And there's a lot of challenges, though, that farmers face. Remember, there were droughts in this period. You have locusts, and then, of course, you have less arable land being available. Maybe you lose your farm. You can't just as easily go get another homestead in this period because the West increasingly is being settled. So you can see why farmers are looking to change things and why some of them will join first the Grangers, and then they're going to join the populist movement. And remember, farmers also work very long hours, 15-hour days, 7 days a week. When you're on the farm, the work is never done, and you can never be too far from your farm either because you have livestock you need to take care of, to feed. You need to milk the cows regularly. You need to protect your fields too. You need to remove weeds and things like that. It's a hard life being a farmer, and while industrial capitalism allows for a lot more economic productivity, it makes farming a lot more competitive. I should also define populism as well as I've defined progressivism. Populism, from the Oxford English Dictionary, it means the policies or principles of any various political parties which seek to represent the interests of the people. And populism can be both a left-wing and a right-wing ideology, as we've seen in recent years. But I'm not talking about present-day populism. I'm talking about the populism that emerges in the American West in the 1880s and 1890s, which they were concerned with the needs of the people, particularly the needs of farmers. It was a sort of a farmers movement first, which makes sense because farmers they were for many years the backbone of the American economy. Things were beginning to change by the 1880s. There were actually more industrial workers by 1880 than there had been in previous decades. By 1880, there were actually more farming workers than there were agricultural workers. But the farmers of the West were looking to protect their interests, and so they're going to form into the populist movement. And because I used this terminology on a previous slide and earlier in the video, left wing versus right wing, some students are not familiar with what this means. I've found that students that I've worked with who are not from the United States, They often don't know what I mean when I say left-wing or right-wing, which is interesting because left-wing and right-wing is actually not from American politics. It originated actually in French politics, particularly the French revolutionary politics. The French government changed multiple times during the revolution, during the French Revolutionary period. Um, but during this period, there was one type of government called the Legislative Assembly, and this was a parliamentary system where the more radical members of the revolution, they're often called the Jacobins, they sat on the left side of the room. They're represented here in red, and then the more just more reform-minded liberals and less radical revolutionists kind of sat more to the left. This would be groups like the Girondists, for example. And as you move towards the center, you had people who were kind of in the middle between revolutionary and between more conservative people that either opposed the revolution or were just trying to keep the revolution from going too far. More independent people who didn't really fit on one side or the other. And then you have the more conservative people on this side. And in American politics, Republicans are represented by red, Democrats are represented by blue. The Republican and Democratic Party, they in some ways they've changed quite a bit since they were founded. In other ways, they're actually quite similar to how they originally started. But in other countries' politics, red is usually the color of radicals and of more reformist, progressive, even revolutionary types of people, whereas blue is the color of conservatives. It's that way in really most other countries, especially English-speaking countries. And on this map of French politics, America, though, it's kind of we have things a bit more mixed up. And so many people in American politics have taken this left revolutionary, progressive, and right conservative, more change averse, and they've applied it to American politics. Really, in some ways, though, if you wanted to stick straight to French politics, American politics overall would be left-wing because we don't have a monarchy in America. Attempts to create a monarchy have failed. We definitely oppose monarchs in this country. The monarchists were on the blue side, the conservative side of the French Legislative Assembly. Now, some people may disagree with that. They'll say that there is no true left in America. They'll say that all American politics are right-wing, and I don't think that that's quite right either. I think it can be kind of useful, left-wing meaning more progressive, meaning even more revolutionary, right-wing meaning a bit more conservative, more traditionalist, more change-averse, reactionary even. I think that that's fine, and that's how I'm going to use it in these terms, because sometimes people will use the term left-wing and right-wing as almost like an insult to kind of lambast the other side. I'm just going to use them in a very general sense, where left-wing will mean a bit more on the pro-change, even pro-revolution side of things, and right-wing will mean more conservative and more change and risk-averse side of things. Now, back to the Populists. An early leader of the Populists was Mary Elizabeth Lease, and she was from Kansas. Her family had faced hard times in the cold, dark Kansas winters, and she became a leading voice for the populist movement, even though she as a woman was not able to vote or run for politics, for political office. She became a very important speaker and lecturer. She traveled around advocating for farmers' interests, and in a nutshell, she told farmers they needed to raise less corn and raise more hell. The idea was by growing too much corn, we're depressing the commodity prices, and we're not going to be really helping ourselves that much by growing more. We need scarcity, actually. We need to organize, and we need to have activism to have meaningful political change. And so what did these populist leaders advocate for? What did the populists call for? They called for price controls. They wanted to have prices be fixed so that they could ship their grains to the market much more cheaply, because they had to basically load their corn and their wheat onto trains. They had to load it using a grain elevator, which would load the heavy grain onto the locomotive cars that would then take it to the city. They wanted those prices to be lowered. That way they could be more profitable. Some of the more radical populists even wanted railroads to be nationalized and taken over by the U.S. government, because There were so many railroads that were all competing with each other with their prices and things like that. And actually, railroad companies also tried their own price fixing. J.P. Morgan would get together with railroad leaders, and they would agree on the prices that they would charge. That way, they weren't all in competition with each other. And really, what they were doing is they were, you might say, ganging up on the American people, including these farmers who needed to ship their grain to market using the railroads. Originally, farmers had been kind of politically aligned with railroad interests. The farmers in the American West, the Midwest, had tended to vote Republican since the party was founded, because the Republican Party was the party of homesteading, it was the party of railroads, and that was helping integrate farmers into the market of the East. But now the market in some ways is too integrated, and the farmers are falling out of love with the railroads. Really, they're beginning to see railroads and bankers and financiers as their opponents. In some cases, they talk about how the big banks and the big Eastern banks and Wall Street are controlling the country in an undue and unfair way. Language actually that would sound a lot like what people say in the 21st century. Another thing that's interesting about Mary Lease is literary scholars have suggested that she may have been an inspiration for the character of Dorothy in L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, which I'm talking about the original L. Frank Baum Wizard of Oz novel that came out at the turn of the century, not the 1930s film. When I see a picture of Mary Elizabeth Lease, I don't think Dorothy from the 1930s film. I think Wicked Witch of the West. That's what I think. And I'm not saying that Lease was a witch. It was said that she had an almost bewitching energy about her. People would watch her and they would be enraptured at how good of a speaker she was. But again, I'm not making a connection between Lease and the 1930s movie. And also, I think, to some degree, I think scholars, especially in the literary field, I was an English major before I switched to history, they tend to overestimate the political themes of L. Frank Baum's story. All authors are going to be influenced to some degree by current events. Populism would have been on the brain for people like Baum, but Baum himself in his own writings said that he meant this story of Wizard of Oz to be much more just about American fairy tales. It was meant to be a fairy tale for American children, to be something that was more wholesome and less violent than, say, the Brothers Grimm tales that were written earlier in the 1800s. But that can be a controversial topic, the supposed political themes of the Wizard of Oz. So these are some other very important populist leaders, and these were men that were actually able to get into politics. They were not as bound by the gender norms of the day as Mary Elizabeth Lease was. The first is William Jennings Bryan, a congressman from Nebraska, and then we have Thomas Watson of Georgia. And really, I think populism comes into its own, particularly under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, sometimes, again, the people who talk about the Wizard of Oz being political, they'll compare William Jennings Bryan to the Cowardly Lion sometimes. I don't think that's a very fair comparison. I don't think it's very fair to William Jennings Bryan, by the way. But what did William Jennings Bryan propose for the Populists? He proposed a change to the American monetary system. Remember, during the Gilded Age, and really for most of American history, we were actually in a deflationary economy. The dollar was backed by gold. There were brief periods where it wasn't, like during the Civil War, but there was not a lot of money printing going on. The dollar's value remained strong because it was tied to a precious metal, and industrialization and more efficient farming methods, it made the cost of goods and services cheaper. So you have increasing supply of goods, and then you have a strong currency. So you had deflation really across time. And this was something that the populists opposed. The populists, believe it or not, they wanted inflation. Why did they want inflation? Because many American farmers were in debt. They had bought farm equipment, they'd bought seed for the next crop on credit, a little bit like the sharecroppers in the South in some ways, buying things on credit, and then they were in trouble if grain prices fell, if there was a drought, if there was a locust infestation. You could potentially lose your land, and then if you've lost your land as a farmer, you've lost everything, and you wouldn't be able to replace it as easily as the West was getting increasingly settled. So they wanted inflation to kind of make their debts easier to pay off. And this was also supposed to just help indebted people in general in eastern cities who maybe aren't Western farmers, but maybe they have debt because they're buying expensive American-made goods because of tariffs. Tariffs are keeping out foreign competition that might be cheaper. It's lowering the supply of goods that are available. Also, domestic industries don't have to be as competitive if their competition is being kept out or being regulated by tariffs. So it also can help indebted people in the East as well. The thing is, though, we know this now, living in an inflationary monetary system, wages do not keep up with inflation. So inflation doesn't really help most people today. I mean, you might argue that maybe someone who's a homeowner, who has a mortgage to pay, they might benefit from inflation, but at the same time, that homeowner is not like a farmer. That homeowner has a job where they're paid wages. That homeowner buys food at the grocery store. At least with the populist farmers, they might have a mortgage that they're trying to pay off with cash, which again, cash was often very tight on the farm, the rural farming communities, the agrarian communities. But if they don't see a lot of cash in hand, they can still feed their family. They can still, grow vegetable gardens. They can still have dairy products. They can raise chickens to have eggs and things like that. They're more shielded from an inflationary monetary system. So really, for them, inflation would be a benefit, although it was not a benefit for many wage-based workers, especially those that were not in debt. And certainly, I don't think inflation is a good thing now. I think on the whole, inflation is a net negative, but that was not how the populists saw it. And this issue with inflation, inflation being a good thing that they want, they're going to accomplish it through something called bimetallism. Bimetallism means two types of metal. Here you see a bell of gold, and then you see a bell of silver. The gold standard is what America has. They want a silver standard as well. They want the dollar to be backed up by gold and silver. Having another precious metal in the U.S. Treasury means there can be more dollars printed. Again, it's not a fiat money system like we had during the Civil War or like we have today. It's still backed up by a precious metal, but now it's backed up by two types of precious metal, gold and then a less expensive but more readily available precious metal of silver. And there was increased silver mining in the American West in places like Nevada, for example. So it makes sense they would be advocating for bimetallism to create a bit of inflation to help the farmers get out of debt, to maybe even help indebted Eastern people. But Eastern wage laborers who are not in debt and who work in factories, they don't want inflation. They're not going to want their wages to be weakened, and they're certainly not going to want to lose out on job opportunities either. So you're going to see the populists over time are going to have a hard time really linking up with urban industrial voters. And also, as I mentioned in my transitional video between AMH 2010 and 2020, the populists are going to have a hard time linking up with Southern farmers, both white and black. Again, the South is a very agrarian part of the country. Southern sharecroppers and farmers were dealing with some of the same issues or very similar issues as these Western homestead farmers, but populists don't do particularly well on the state or on the national level in the South. They maybe can win some local elections, but Southern society is much more racially divided than it is class divided. Poor white Southerners choose to side with rich white Southerners rather than uniting with African Americans in a more populistic manner. So, again, the populists are going to struggle in the South because of racial issues, and they're going to struggle to get people in the more industrial part of the country to support them because that group of people does not want inflation, and that group of people is more likely to support tariffs, something that the populists don't like either. One last reason that the populists don't like tariffs is it makes things like imported agricultural equipment more expensive because it's coming into the country. There's going to be extra fees and taxes that have to be paid, but also American farmers are going to want to export grain to places like Europe via Canada and via Britain. And if America is putting tariffs on, say, British goods, Britain might put tariffs on American agricultural products. I've already talked about the 1892 election in my second video on the Gilded Age, but just a refresher. This is the election where the Populists run James B. Weaver as a populist candidate. He does well out west. He takes away votes, I would argue, from Harrison, because this is a more Republican part of the country, the West. Again, the farmers originally had been linked with the Republicans, but as they've gotten more upset with industrialists and bankers and railroads, they're looking for a alternative, and that's going to be the Populist Party or the People's Party, led by James B. Weaver. And as you can see, they get Kansas, where Mary Elizabeth Lease was active. They get Colorado. They get Nevada. They get Idaho. Remember, Nevada was an area of silver mining, so having a bimetal system is going to be something that's going to benefit the people of Nevada as well, even those that are not farmers. But that's the Populists in the '92 election, and I would argue that they helped the Democrats under Grover Cleveland get the White House again. Grover Cleveland will win his second non-consecutive term, and Grover Cleveland really, in many ways, was hostile to a lot of populist issues. He had vetoed farm aid bills. He supported a tight money economic system, and he really believed in kind of a limited government that did not get involved in helping fix economic problems. I brought up many of these ideas on a different slide, but I thought I would kind of crystallize them here. The things that the populists want are farm subsidies, being paid to not grow things. That way they can increase scarcity. Farm subsidies can be very lucrative for farmers, actually. I have a relative that my great uncle who received farm subsidies for many years, which he ended up actually not using for himself. He used them to found education funds for local students in Minnesota, particularly students who came from Native American reservations. But anyway, these subsidies could really be a lot of money if applied for and then used properly. Income taxes to close wealth disparities. And again, people who support income taxes believe that income taxes were primarily going to be paid by the upper class, not by everyday people. They wanted price controls for railroad shipping, uniform prices for grain elevators that load the grain into the trains. Some, the more radical ones, even call for things like railroad nationalization and even the land value tax, which that was more of a Georgist idea, but there is a bit of cross-pollination between Georgism and the later populism. And they're very anti-Wall Street, anti-big bank, anti-big business, anti-kind of coastal banker elite. Some scholars who are more critical of the populists suggest that there's a almost anti-Semitic tone to some of their anti-bank rhetoric. That's a debatable point. That's for others to decide. I'll just explaining how you might interpret some of their anti-banker language, which, by the way, it sounds a lot like things that people were saying, for example, during Occupy Wall Street in 2011. And there were some attempts to link up with urban labor movements like the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, kind of in the early period of populism and sort of the waning period of the Knights of Labor, because the Knights of Labor pretty much are done after 1886. But again, they're going to diverge from labor and industrial voters on issues like tariffs and on silver. Industrial workers are not going to want inflation. It's going to hurt their wages. Industrial workers are going to support tariffs as well because it protects their jobs. It ensures they don't have as much competition from foreign imports. Remember, the populists, they want bimetallism to cause inflation. Dollars backed by gold and silver. This is still a monetary system where there is backing for the currency. It's not a fiat system. And the idea is having more inflation will allow the farmers to pay off their debts more quickly. And tariffs made goods more expensive, and they could lead to retaliatory tariffs on their own agricultural products that they may want to export out of the United States. And here are some images of William Jennings Bryan. He gave a very famous and impassioned speech called the Cross of Gold speech in 1895. Here he is being celebrated after his speech. In this speech, to summarize, he said, "I will not have the American people be crucified on a cross of gold," saying that the gold standard, the tight money system, it was bad for the American people, it put people into poverty, and he wanted bimetallism. And this is a kind of an anti-Bryan cartoon from Judge magazine, which was kind of like Puck magazine. It was a political cartoon magazine, but Judge magazine was much more for the Republican Party, and they're kind of mocking Bryan as thinking he's kind of a Christ figure with his gold cross and his crown of thorns, and kind of making him look, trying to make him look portray him in a negative light. But I do think Bryan had some reasons to dislike the gold standard system beyond just the lack of inflation, and he trying to support indebted people. In the 1890s, we have the Panic of 1893, and the American government almost defaulted. It almost ran out of gold after foreign banks tried to withdraw their gold, basically by selling their dollars back. And J.P. Morgan, the big banker, basically filled up the U.S. Treasury with gold in exchange for Treasury bonds. And they would argue that, being so reliant on gold, it made America vulnerable, and it allowed people like J.P. Morgan to have an undue influence over American politics because he holds so many Treasury bonds. And by the way, there was a similar kind of thing took place in 1907 as well, where America almost defaulted again because of our strict reliance on a gold standard. And I went over this slide in a previous lecture as well, so I'm not going to go over it in too much detail, but by 1896, populism had become a popular enough ideology that it could actually basically take over the Democratic Party, in opposition to the Republican Party, which is the party of banks, of railroads, and I would argue on the whole more the party of big business in this period. And William Jennings Bryan, he is a rising star from Nebraska. He's going to be their candidate. They're going to want to balance the tickets. They'll choose Arthur Sewell, a New York banker, as their VP, but there were many that wanted Tom Watson of Georgia to be the VP, another populist. In the end, though, it's a loss for the Democrats, for the populists. The Republican Party just has an advantage. It's going after bigger, more populated states in the Northeast and the kind of older Eastern Midwest, and so they win in both the popular vote and they win commandingly in the Electoral College. And some sources have pointed out that this was a signal that industrial politics were the future of America, and to some degree that is true. America is becoming more industrial in this period, but again, rural and agrarian people have had a large voice in American politics over time, and some might even say an outsized voice, considering that there are more urban Americans than rural Americans from the 1920s on. In 1900, William Jennings Bryan runs again for president with the Democratic Party. Things are changing. Populism is beginning to lose some of its luster. The economy in 1900 was good, much stronger than it had been in the 1890s, especially the early 1890s. So a strong economy is going to blunt some of the populist appeals, against the banks and against big business. Also, it's going to help the incumbent, William McKinley, who was already president. A good economy helps the president who's in office, who's the incumbent. And McKinley is also a war hero president, not McKinley himself. McKinley did fight in the Civil War, but he was a president during the war, and he's joined by Teddy Roosevelt, who is a Spanish-American war hero, as his VP. And also the Republicans, they run a more expensive, more modern campaign, taking advantage of the technologies of the day. And Bryan also was an anti-imperialist, which this is the beginning of kind of American imperialism, or at least American imperialism overseas, after the Spanish-American War. And at the same time, Bryan does not do well in this election. Really, he does worse in this election than he did in the previous election, 1896, just because of changes to America, changes to the American economy, changes to American foreign policy. He does a little bit better in the South, but worse on the whole in the West. The Populists really, they're in decline as a party. They don't come out for him the way they had in 96. And some states that had voted for the Democrats in 1896, because of the populism, they're going to go back to voting for the Republicans in 1900. Notable examples being places like Kansas, for example. And again, this is the first election of the fourth party system. Um, the populist era is coming to an end, and the progressive era is beginning in 1900. And I said it really begins in 1901, after the assassination of William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. He took over after McKinley was assassinated. This is the fourth party system. The Republicans represented in red, the Democrats represented in blue, and as you can see, the solid South is still pretty solid. The Republicans, they do well in the Northeast, the Midwest, and then most of the American West and Great Plains region. The Democrats do have some strength in the West, but generally they're still more of a Southern party, although Texas is both a Southern state and a Western state. And during this period, 1896 to 1932, the Republican Party controls the White House for most of this period, the exceptions being during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. And then, of course, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to be elected president, ending the fourth party system. We've talked about presidential assassinations before in my lecture videos, and I want to talk about the assassination of President McKinley because the assassination of a president is a historic event. It can lead to political changes. It can lead to many different changes. And I think McKinley also, he's sort of a end of an era type politician. He was the last American politician that, or rather the last American president, I should say. He's the last American president that actually wrote his own speeches and then presented them. Nowadays, and really from after McKinley, they would have speechwriters writing their speeches, and they would make some edits or make some changes before reading them to the public. But McKinley liked to write his own speeches, and he was the last president to really do that, which is always interesting to me that when I read a speech from Abraham Lincoln or Andrew Jackson or even a failed presidential candidate, knowing that they wrote this themselves rather than having speechwriters write it for them is always really profound to me. It's very interesting, noticing the differences in speaking styles and speech styles, especially as presidents stop writing their own speeches and have others do it for them. And he was shot at the Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, New York, September 6, 1901. McKinley also really liked to engage with the public, meeting people, shaking hands. He said that was one of his favorite parts about being president. That's what biographies have noted about him. The man who shot him was a unemployed anarchist. The bullet, unfortunately, was lost. Something really similar happened to James Garfield. The medical technology of the day was just not sophisticated enough to really find the bullet. There was an early X-ray machine that was at the expo, but it wasn't used. The doctors didn't really understand how it worked. They thought it would just make McKinley's condition worse. Eventually, Edison actually tried to send a X-ray machine to the doctors that were in charge of taking care of President McKinley, but they weren't able to find the bullet, and McKinley died very slowly and painfully, a lot like James Garfield did. And Vice President Teddy Roosevelt's going to take over, and he was a committed progressive, much more so than McKinley was. McKinley had some kind of proto-progressive ideas, but he was not as committed to progressive values of using politics for social and economic change the way Teddy Roosevelt or the way William Taft and Woodrow Wilson would be later on. But other things that McKinley's assassination did was it led to the formation of the Secret Service. Presidents had bodyguards before this, but the bodyguards protecting McKinley and protecting James Garfield and protecting Abraham Lincoln had failed at their jobs. So we needed a more professionalized law enforcement organization to protect the president and that fits with the progressive era values of professionalization and education. Having a better trained security detail for the president is going to protect the president's life, and the progressives are all about professionalization and education and growing the size of the government. Also, the FBI is founded in 1908, largely because of McKinley's assassination. Originally, they're just called the Bureau of Investigation, the BOI, but they're founded a few years later in 1908, and their goal was, again, to professionalize law enforcement and investigation, but they were really trying to investigate radicals, anarchists, socialists, etc., because it was believed that these radicals were dangerous and that they might try to kill another president. And they weren't wrong for thinking that, as you're going to see later on in this video when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt. In my endeavor to define progressivism, I said that many progressives were educators. They wanted to teach people, but they also wanted to use their own education to fix social problems. And that was something that they thought could fix society because they had the expertise, they had the professionalism, and they could save capitalism from themselves. And they really they drew from emerging academic fields like sociology, political science, psychology in order to accomplish these things. This is sociologist Thurston Veblen, and Veblen was a very important thinker to progressives. He wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, and he's actually the guy that coined the term conspicuous consumption in 1899. And the progressives were very bothered by conspicuous consumption, especially Woodrow Wilson. They thought that the nouveau riche, new money, people like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the wealthiest people in the country, that they were not like the rich people of the past who had sobriety and may have been wealthy, but they knew how to behave properly. These new rich people, they believed in conspicuous consumption and rubbing it in the face of others that they had so much money, and therefore that was why we needed things like income taxes. And Woodrow Wilson, in some of his writings, even toyed with the idea of sumptuary laws to prevent conspicuous consumption and kind of make keep the upper class from being the dangerous class that was corrupting the poor and middle class with their bad rich people habits of conspicuous consumption. But the progressives, they liked ideologies like this because then they could use these ideologies and these academic terms to justify policy changes, to call for new types of legislation and things of that nature. So academia and progressivism in this period are really inextricably linked. This is John Dewey, another important progressive intellectual. He supported education reform in the progressive era. This is a period where education was changing thanks to things like the Morrill Act, the land-grant university system. K-12 education was expanding as well. The one-room schoolhouses of early America, where grades were all mixed together, people only went for part of the year. That was changing. Compulsory education is becoming more common in the States. And there's concern, and not without reason, that education might be too authoritarian, that there's not a democratic enough approach to education. That's where John Dewey comes in. He wanted to give students more choice in their education, and he wanted to make education more practical and vocational as well, which, again, that's been happening since the days of the Morrill Act. During this period, America is also adopting elements of the Prussian education system, which is really designed to help people keep to a schedule, to know when to show up for class and when to leave. That helps to create very good, very disciplined industrial workers. It can also create very good soldiers as well, as America is, in many ways, is becoming more militaristic as the 1800s come to an end and the 1900s begin. And Dewey is sometimes criticized today for his politics, and some would say that his principles, while democratic in the context of the early 20th century, would not be considered democratic today. But I do think John Dewey, in his attempt to make education more vocational and expansive, it really helps to create that American managerial class, which that American managerial class is going to be the class it's going to support progressivism, either directly by getting into politics, or by voting for progressive legislation and politicians, or by working in progressive causes and working for non-elected government bureaucratic positions. When we're talking about progressivism and expansions of American bureaucracy and the administrative state, we have to talk about the progressives and democracy because they have a complex and I would say nuanced relationship with democracy. It was a very important progressive plank to support expanding the franchise, especially for women, primarily for white women, though. Some of the suffragettes who supported women gaining the right to vote, they were primarily focused on white women, and some, like Susan B. Anthony, for example, made it very clear that they were primarily focused on getting white women the right to vote. Um, Progressives also, they believed in things like direct elections of senators, that you, the voter, ought to be able to vote for the senators who represent your state in Washington. This is what will lead to the 17th Amendment in 1913. And so they're pro-democracy. They want to expand the franchise. They want voters to be able to vote on more things. They are concerned about the wealthy elite, that they're threatening democracy by bribing politicians, by encouraging corruption. At the same time, though, they also have kind of a mistrust of democracy as well, or certainly a mistrust of democratic institutions, you might say. They feared that politicians that are elected, they would just do whatever was popular to remain in office. They wouldn't necessarily do what the American people needed to have done, because maybe what the American people needed and what they wanted would be two different things, and a politician would just basically try to remain in office by giving the people what they wanted, even if what they wanted was bad or unsustainable. Other areas where they helped to promote democracy were secret ballots, voter reforms, attempts to stop voter fraud and voter intimidation and corruption. Because remember, in the 1800s, alcohol and politics were really inextricably linked. You often voted at the local saloon. You might have a drink as well after you voted, given to you by the local political boss. And the local political boss would help you vote, in some cases literally help you vote. And that was very corrupt. They might keep certain people from voting. Certainly in the South, they were keeping African Americans from voting and eventually passing laws to keep black people in the South from voting. But bringing in things like secret ballots and eventually even things like identification, this is stuff that's coming out in the progressive era to make elections freer, to make them fairer, to make them more transparent. And really it makes it easier for new voters like women to vote, because they're not going to go into the saloon, which was a masculine place. It was a place of alcohol consumption. It was a place of cigar smoking, slapping people on the back, and even other things like gambling or prostitution, things that women voters did not support and that they opposed. So again, they want to make democracy more accessible, even as in some ways they're mistrusting democracy. And sadly, in the South, white Southerners, their attempts to continue to restrict African Americans' voting rights through literacy exams, through the various grandfather clauses, they actually would use almost progressive language to describe their discriminatory policies. So, you could be a progressive but still be supporting some very unprogressive things. You'll just talk like you're a progressive. And then the progressives also supported the expansion of, and even in some cases just the creation of government agencies and what we would call the administrative state, the American bureaucracy. Some people today might call it the deep state. Government bureaus and agencies that actually handle a lot of the governance of America. Regulations and things like that are not just going to be handled by Congress or by the president. They're going to be handled by these unelected government officials. And the idea is these government officials are unelected, and they can be more responsive to the American people, but they can also do the things that an elected politician is unwilling to do. An early example of this would be the Dayton, Ohio city manager government that was established in 1913. Dayton, Ohio, it's an often forgotten about city in America today, in the state of Ohio, and often, I would say, unfairly forgotten about a state in American history. Having lived there for 6 years, I often felt like we were forgotten about, except maybe when it was election time. But it's the city of the Wright brothers. It's the city of Kettering, who developed electric starters for cars, and then they also made some really important political developments as well, namely the city manager government system, where you would elect the mayor, and then the mayor would appoint a city manager who would then run the day-to-day operations of the city, particularly things like law enforcement and setting up public utilities. Public utilities were very important in the late 1800s and early 1900s as American cities are expanding. You need to have new sewer systems, new water systems, electricity, gas lines. And before things like the city manager system were set up, you had to go to the local political boss to make sure you got water into your neighborhood or sewer out of your neighborhood. But now with a nonpartisan city manager that's appointed by an elected official, there's not going to be that kind of favoritism that's going on. The city manager is going to work for the entire city. At least that's the hope and the plan of the progressives, is that by having this stuff done by unelected officials, it can be done more fairly and in a more equitable manner. Because, again, democracy in some ways is a very good thing to the progressives. More people get to vote. More people get to vote on more things. But also, the people in power, if they're there by elections, they might do things that just are popular, not necessarily things that are good. This is a 1904 cartoon from Colorado. It actually shows a minor party, the Prohibition Party, not like a major party like the Democrats or the Republicans. Here, they are stamping out saloon corruption with giving people the right to vote, particularly for prohibition issues. Prohibition, actually, believe it or not, was a progressive issue, and I'll explain why a bit more on this slide and later. Again, alcohol and politics were linked together in the 1800s. Progressives wanted to remove the corruption from politics, particularly the corruption that came from alcohol. And by prohibiting alcohol, you were taking alcohol out of the saloon, and thus you could take politics out of the saloon and into a public voting precinct, which would be much more fair and objective and not so corrupt, because there was corruption that would happen in these saloons and in these political rings. You can see from this slide here, corruption out of the saloon is like an octopus. Political corruption, partnering with thieves, gambling, not following the law. This one here, human trafficking, particularly of young girls, things like that were happening. And that's actually, human trafficking is also going to be an issue that the progressives are really going to fight against as well. Prohibition and progressivism were linked. It was seen as a way to get politics to be less corrupt. Also, alcohol was seen as being more of a male vice, and a lot of women who supported women getting the right to vote and who supported women having more of a position in politics, they wanted to get rid of alcohol, or at least get it out of the saloons. That saloon culture, that drinking culture was corrupt. It was intimidating to women. Also, saloon culture, drinking culture, it had a ethnic component to it. It was seen as being belonging to immigrants, beer drinking Germans, wine sipping Italians, vodka sampling Russians, and it had to be controlled by creating dry municipalities and dry counties. So you have dry counties in urban, not urban areas, but municipalities, but then eventually you'll have dry states. The first state actually to go dry was not was the state of Maine in the 1850s. Many people think that Prohibition was a Southern phenomenon, but really Prohibition was nationwide. There were Southerners and Northerners that supported Prohibition. The temperance movement of the early 1800s evolved into the Prohibition movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Prohibitionism became a part of progressivism for many years. And you can see on this map here, the white counties are the dry counties. There's a lot of dry counties in the south and a lot in many parts of the west, but there's also many wet counties as well in parts of the west. And in the northeast, you see a lot of the prohibition is happening on a municipal level, which is why you have a mix of dry counties and wet counties in places like Pennsylvania, for example. But I argue, and I think honest historians will argue that prohibition started out as a progressive issue that many progressives who wanted to fix society wanted to fix. It was also a religious issue too, but many progressives were also religious. The thing is, though, over time, the progressives do move away from prohibition. As progressivism is dying out, prohibitionism also is dying out in America. But that's more of a discussion for the 1920s, which we'll get to in a future lecture. Other really important and controversial issues that were very relevant in the turn of the century. How do the American people relate to corporations and monopolies that are emerging during this period? The Standard Oil Trust, Carnegie Steel, which eventually becomes U.S. Steel. And progressives could vary on economic issues. Some were a bit more socialistic, others were more capitalistic, but generally they agreed that the government needed to take a more active role in the American economy. It needed to save capitalism from itself. If you, assuming you supported capitalism, which most progressives, they believed more on this mixed economy saving capitalism from itself. The ones that were more socialistic, they were more on the fringe. They were the people like Eugene Debs, for example. But the progressives generally, as a more unified group, they're generally anti-corporate and they're generally anti-monopoly because trust busting is a good thing for the American people. It brings competition back into the economy. Having all of an industry controlled by just one guy or one family is going to lead to corruption. It's going to lead to undue influence in politics, and also it gives consumers fewer choices. And this is I think rather interesting. It's something I've noticed in my study of the big business leaders and their quest for efficiency and their quest to fight waste. Progressives also were anti-waste and pro-efficiency. They thought that the reforms they were introducing to American politics and to the American economy were ultimately going to make America a more efficient place, a more equitable place. So they both like efficiency. The big business leaders that you see, running away from the progressives on this slide. They're running away specifically from William Jennings Bryan in this image. They both want to eliminate waste. They both want to eliminate inefficiency. It's just the business leaders want to do it through monopoly, and the progressives want to do it through the government and through trust busting, breaking up monopolies. And of course, Standard Oil is eventually going to be broken up using the Sherman Antitrust Act, which I discussed in a previous video. Political movements and subcultures in general often have what is called a unified lexicon. They have language and they have terminology which they use, and they use this to have a unique identity, and they use it to signal that they're a part of the movement, and they also use it as a way to discriminate between who is in the movement and who is out of the movement based on how well they're using the language. It's almost like shibboleth, the old term of shibboleths, how you say that term or what words you use, that will indicate whether you're a part of the movement or whether you're outside of the movement and an enemy. You see this quite a bit in other movements as well, other subcultures as well. Even very apolitical subcultures have a terminology that they use amongst themselves. And really, in some ways, it's about marking insiders and outsiders, in-group, out-group. In other ways, it's almost like just an inside joke in a way, that it's something that you can all kind of bond over. And I think, unfortunately, some movements, especially those that are more political, they will use this unified lexicon and unified terminology, and the fact that sometimes a word means one thing to outsiders, but it means something else to their own community, to exploit and create misunderstanding, to exploit people, you might say. Some might call this even dog whistle terminology, which the term dog whistle is from much later in American history. It's really anachronistic to use it here, but the idea of words meaning different things to different people based on the context and based on group membership. But the language the progressives specifically liked, they came from religion, because many progressives were religious, even though there were secular progressives. They came from military language. Some progressives had been in the military, namely people like Teddy Roosevelt. They also like to think of things as a battle or as a war or a struggle to go against. And they also liked medical language and symbolism as well. They would they like to, you could say, medicalize social problems. That way they could be a remedy to social problems that they, of course, were going to provide the medicine for, the solution for. This is a cartoon here. It's showing Teddy Roosevelt making his, here he's more like a chef than a doctor, but he's kind of making his remedy, making his recipe. He's got all kinds of bottles. He's got a little bit of radicalism, but also a little bit of conservatism, and then some progressivism, all kind of coming together in his speeches. And you also see this in a lot of the journalistic work of the progressive movement, the crusade against human trafficking, the crusade against alcohol, which is, of course, crusade is both a military term and a religious term, although people don't really like to use the term crusade nowadays because of its religious connotations and its links to the crusades of medieval times. Now people will say things like the war on drugs is in some ways a throwback to the language of the progressivism of the early 1900s. And really, believe it or not, the war on drugs that we have today in America has its origins in the progressive era as well. And there were some major problems that the progressives were trying to fix, and the language and terminology they used was tied to their theories and their plans for addressing these social problems. And we're talking about problems like child labor. We're talking about problems like people consuming too much alcohol and not providing for their families, or getting to be abusive, crowding in cities, public health issues, not just because of urban crowding or because of a lack of facilities, but a lack of regulation on the food system. This leads to works like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which will be talked about later. Disasters in urban centers, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, which the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was an event in which a factory in New York City that produced shirtwaists, they're women's blouses, basically. They're called shirtwaists. The factory employed a lot of young, especially Jewish immigrant women who worked at the factory. These women, young women in their teens, many who were from Eastern Europe, and they would be locked into the factory to keep them from taking unauthorized breaks or from possibly walking off with merchandise from the factory. The belief that these workers were lazy or dishonest was kind of informing some of the management's decisions as to how they ran their factory. But you're working with textiles. All it would take is a lost spark, a lone spark, from the equipment. There could be a spark. Someone may be trying to smoke a secret cigarette. There could be a spark, and the factory caught on fire, and tragic casualties as the women tried to escape. There were not proper fire escapes. There were not proper sprinkler systems to prevent a fire, and really, really tragic loss of life. Nearly 150 people died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It's considered to be one of America's worst industrial disasters, and it's going to lead to some really important building codes and regulations, particularly around fire mitigation and fire retardant systems. So what were some other ways that the progressives wanted to fix social problems? One means was through the social gospel. And I like to talk about the social gospel because there were many religious progressives, just as there were some secular progressives. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the Supreme Court Justice, very secular. John Dewey was a very secular person, and they were both in the progressive movement. But there were also some very important religious progressives as well. And religious language was often used by progressive leaders to motivate people and to make the causes of progressivism seem more urgent and important. So what is the social gospel? In some ways, the social gospel is meant to be kind of the opposite of social Darwinism, rather than just, letting the chips fall, helping some of the poor, leaving others in the dust. The social gospel says the rich must take care of the poor, and they cite religious inspirations, particularly from the Bible, and the Bible talks about how it's important to help the poor and to not oppress the poor, and the goal is to create heaven on earth. Which that was language that was used in the early 1800s in the Second Great Awakening. It's going to be used by advocates of the social gospel as well. And as far as the social gospel issues, they're supporting things like the prohibition of alcohol, regulation of the economy to make the economy more equitable to help the poor, social welfare programs and education, like you can see on this slide. To some degree, I would say the education and the assimilation of immigrants to a more American form of Christianity. And there's debate about where and how the social gospel begins. Some have argued that more historians of American religion argue that it has roots in a group of people called the Primitive Baptists. They were Baptists in Appalachia who went to very small churches, and they really tried to recreate the way they thought that the church was when it was first founded in the first century AD or CE in the ancient Middle East. Very small, almost like house churches where the goods, the property of the members were shared almost communally and in kind. Others have argued that it's linked more towards, or it's linked more with the antebellum reform movements in the Second Great Awakening. This creating heaven on earth language really aligns with how things were being discussed during the Second Great Awakening and during the early to mid 1800s. Others would say that actually it has to do with increased education and increased professionalism, and that theologians, particularly in parts of the Northeast and Midwest, they really created the social gospel movement as a way of dealing with social problems that were emerging at the turn of the century. Some even might point to new religious ideas that were beginning to emerge in America. Things like the Azusa Street Revival. The Azusa Street Revival took place from about 1906 to 1915. It was, many would say, the beginning of the Pentecostal version of Christianity, the Pentecostal sect of Christianity in America. There's a variety of dates. It's about 1906 to 1915. There's disagreement amongst Pentecostals even about when it begins and when it ends. You may even point to increased Catholic immigration to the United States. As more Catholics are coming into the country, they're bringing new Catholic ideas as well about helping the poor. Groups like the Jesuits, for example, were very committed to helping the poor within Catholicism. But I think above all, even more than the Primitive Baptists, even more than the Pentecostals and the Azusa Street, even more than Catholics coming into the country and other non-Protestant Christians coming into the country, I think it was the academics of the Northeast and parts of the Midwest that really helped to create the social gospel. And this is going to be people like Richard Ely, Josiah Strong, but especially Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. And Walter Rauschenbusch in particular, he wrote a book called Christianity and the Social Order in 1907 and Theology for the Social Gospel. And they were really the ones that that kind of created the philosophy and the theology that inspired this making heaven on earth, rich taking care of the poor, regulating the economy, even in some cases moving the economy in a more socialistic manner. And they also, these theologians, they worked to really redefine Christianity in some ways. Jesus Christ had talked about the importance of helping the poor, not oppressing the poor, and that was an important part of his ministry. But the leadership of the social gospel, people like Gladden in particular, really began to question what is called the inerrancy of Scripture. They began to question the more miraculous elements of the Bible, things like the divinity of Christ, even the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These are miraculous events that more traditional and Orthodox Christians, they believe are kind of essential parts of the Christian religion. And without these miraculous elements, they don't believe that it's even really a religion anymore. But the social gospel advocates, especially the theological leaders, said that the miraculous elements, either they didn't happen or they were much more allegorical, and that evangelism, that is, getting people to convert to Christianity, should not be the primary focus of Christianity anymore. The primary focus of Christianity should be social justice and fixing social problems. So supporters of the social gospel, they said, we are making Christianity more modern, which is why the social gospel people are often called modernists as well sometimes. But critics of these so-called modernists, of these social gospel proponents, they say that it is good to help the poor and have your political beliefs, but religion should be about growing your religion, about having people convert to Christianity. And they might even say things like, you're making Christianity more of a what they would call a works-based religion. That is, a religion where in order to have heaven and have meaning, you have to work. Christianity promises to be a religion of grace. Through the actions of Jesus Christ, people can be saved, which is what more traditional Christians promise. And they may have more faith-based elements, or they may have more works-based elements, but ultimately it's about what Jesus Christ did as opposed to what the individual Christian did. So this is the social gospel. It emerges during the progressive era, and there are many religious progressives who would be advocates of the social gospel, even as they are working to change some elements of Christianity to make it more in line with their progressive goals of fixing social and political problems. Many problems had developed in the Gilded Age related to urban crowding, urban poverty, poor accommodations for the rapidly increasing urban populations. And during the Progressive Era, there were meaningful attempts to regulate construction and to ensure that urban crowding would not be as big of an issue, and also to make sure the accommodations for working class and poor people in the cities would be better. Um, for this, we have the Tenement Act of 1901. The Tenement Act of 1901, it banned the dumbbell tenements that I talked about in a previous video. The new provisions were that tenements had to have outward-facing windows, they had to have wider hallways for better ventilation, and the individual apartments had to be larger. That way there'd be enough living space for the tenants. In addition, the new 1901 tenant apartments would have to have indoor plumbing in each individual unit. You could not have shared indoor plumbing, shared facilities, or just an outhouse or a privy like you would have seen in earlier buildings. So this is done to make the buildings safer and cleaner and make living in them more pleasant. There's also changes to make these buildings more fire proof and to make them more escapable in the event of a fire. And also courtyards. Courtyards have to be larger in these new post-1901 tenements. That way buildings can be more easily cleaned and garbage can be removed more easily. So they're designed to clean up these buildings to make them safer and to make them more sanitary, make them less prone to burning down in fires and more escapable in the event of fires, just to make them a more pleasant place to live for the urban poor, the urban working class, and for the immigrants that are coming into the country during this period. And works like Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, that came out back in the 1890s, they convinced middle class and even some upper class people that reforms such as the Tenement Act were necessary, because as I said before, a lot of middle class and upper class people were leaving the big cities and moving out into the streetcar suburbs and railroad suburbs, and they were not as familiar with the poverty and challenge that the urban poor were facing. In many cases, they were just apathetic, out of sight, out of mind. But you can see that in the Progressive Era, there's an increased concern in trying to help the poor through these government regulations. In addition to improving the cities by regulating accommodations and tenements, you also have things like Hull House, an education center that was set up by Jane Addams, seen here in this slide. I already mentioned some things about Jane Addams, that she would go on to found the American Civil Liberties Union. She would also be sort of the founder of modern social work in America, and her efforts to help the poor of Chicago were significant. And some of the buildings that were part of the Hull House complex were actually still standing into the 1960s. Much of the campus has since been overtaken or absorbed by the University of Illinois Chicago campus. The progressives wanted to reform American cities. They wanted to make American politics more democratic, at least in their version of democracy. And they also wanted to reform the American monetary and economic system. They supported income taxes, but they also wanted to regulate the banking system. And one of the most significant pieces of progressive era legislation that is still in effect today is the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And really, the Federal Reserve Act established a powerful U.S. central bank. Really, it reestablished a U.S. central bank with 12 branches. Technically, if you want to get into the minutia of the Federal Reserve is technically not the U.S. government bank. It is its own entity. This was done to make sure that the Federal Reserve will be nonpartisan, or as nonpartisan as possible. Although it's debatable how nonpartisan the Federal Reserve can be, because chairs of the Fed are appointed by the president. And the Fed, with its 12 branches that were spread across the country, it was created for two reasons. One, to minimize the influence of the big East Coast, especially New York banks. And it was also created to basically act as a lender of last resort in the event of economic panics that really the U.S. had been going through every 15 or so years, 1873, 1893, and then in 1907. And these branches, basically, they would help to keep smaller banks from failing and to prevent these economic panics from turning into really serious recessions. And they're also meant to basically make it unnecessary for big bankers and financiers like J.P. Morgan, who would come in and essentially bail out the U.S. Treasury in the event of a run on American gold. Um, so that was the Fed's job. It was to prevent future economic panics, to regulate the banking system, to minimize the influence of the big East Coast banks, especially those related to J.P. Morgan. And you could debate how effective the Fed has been at um, preventing economic panics. You could debate whether it's a truly nonpartisan institution. I'm not going to get into those debates here in this video. Some people think that the Federal Reserve System was an innovation and a net positive. Others like to call it the Beast from Jekyll Island because its original plan was developed at a resort in Jekyll Island, Georgia. Related to the Federal Reserve Act is the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. It was passed in 1909, but it wasn't ratified until 1913. It took several years to build up enough support from the states in order to ratify the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. And what does the 16th Amendment do? Well, it created national income taxes, something that the U.S. had not had since the Civil War years, and technically they had them until 1872. But there were constitutional concerns with federal income taxes about whether taxes should be collected by the state or by the federal government. In my interpretation of the Constitution, I do believe that the federal government has the right to collect taxes, but there are certain taxes it can and cannot collect. And the understanding was for much of the post-Civil War and Gilded Age period that a income tax was what would be called a head tax or a poll tax, similar to the poll taxes that you might pay to get to vote in some southern states, and that therefore the income tax was unconstitutional. However, as time went on, as the massive wealth disparities of the Gilded Age emerged, and as more and more Americans are wage laborers, wage workers, there was a thought that an income tax actually could be a good thing because it would close wealth disparities and it would make tariffs less important, which would really help in industrial workers who were in manufacturing who did not want to have competition from foreign imports, and that basically the income tax would be the progressive thing to do. So there was an attempt to pass and implement a federal income tax in 1894, but it was struck down by the Supreme Court, as you can see in this cartoon here, which shows the income tax as a dog that's being abused, having cans thrown at it and bricks thrown at it. The idea is that the income tax is a good thing, and this is something we should implement. And basically, what happens is, in order to get the 16th Amendment, passed and then ratified by the states, there has to be a lot of political wheeling and dealing that takes place. The Progressive era presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson all supported the income tax and all played a role in getting this legislation passed. There was especially a concern from some of the southern states about implementing this income tax, and the way it was sold to some of the more, you could say, conservative type voters was that money from the income tax, one, it would replace tariffs, and two, this money could be used to fund the national defense. Particularly, it could be used to set up military bases in places like the South. During the Spanish-American War, the U.S. realized it needed to have more military bases in the South. I'll go over why
why that is, or why they realized that, in a future video when I talk about American foreign policy during this period. But the idea was this money could be used to fund the military, it could be used for the common defense, it would close wealth disparities, it would make the controversial issue of tariffs just less relevant. They wouldn't be as necessary as a source of revenue anymore because now we have the income tax. And again, in the beginning, everyday Americans were convinced that this was a good thing because taxes in general were low. The highest earners only paid about 7%, and average Americans typically paid about 1%. So it wasn't going to be a significant burden. It wasn't going to be a major threat to business growth, and it was an idea that it would basically close wealth disparities and fund the government through means other than tariffs. Some might point out, though, that there's a problem with income taxes because they weren't just thinking in terms of revenue, that there was what you might call envy-based policies, that this wasn't just about raising revenue, it was about envy towards the ultra-wealthy, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, etc. That's what some critics of income taxes of the 16th Amendment might say. And also, I like this comic here. It's showing a dog kind of running away from a can. It makes me think actually of another pet, a cat coming out of the bag. And once the cat's out of the bag, you're not going to put it back in. The taxes under the income tax are very low in the beginning, but they're going to increase with time, and they're quite a bit higher today for the average American, and even for wealthy Americans, although there's lots of carve-outs and there's deductions and write-offs and things like that. But taxes were often increased in the 20th century, especially during wartime and during events like the Great Depression. But we'll talk about tax increases in multiple future videos, as well as tax decreases as well. But people who talk about in 2025 wanting to eliminate the income tax, to replace it with tariffs or some other form of tax revenue, sales tax, things of that nature, I don't think that's going to happen. You might disagree with me, but I don't think it's going to be replaced. Up next for key progressive legislation is the 17th Amendment. This amendment is less controversial. It was passed in 1912 and ratified and put into act in 1913. And this amendment allows for direct election of U.S. senators by the voters. Before the 17th Amendment, senators were generally elected by the state legislature. You would vote for your state Congress person, and then you would vote for your state senators, and they would vote for the senator that would represent your state in Washington, D.C. Progressives had a complex relationship with democracy, but they generally supported expanding the franchise and extending the franchise, making it so there were more things that you, the voter, could actually vote on. And this cartoon, which is from 1890, shows the corruption that comes when you have your senators not voted on by the people, but by the state legislature, that you can make donations to political campaigns, you can lobby the state legislature, and in doing so, you can get yourself a position in the U.S. Senate. Supporters of the 17th Amendment will say that this is a good thing. It gives voters more of a chance to choose who represents them in Washington, D.C. More things to vote on is good. Opponents or detractors or people who are more hesitant about the 17th Amendment will suggest that this is not the vision for the U.S. Senate that the Founding Fathers had. The Founding Fathers had a complex idea about democracy. They believed in checks and balances on the various branches of the government, but also on checks and balances on what the American people could vote for, trying to balance republicanism, res publica, the public good, with democracy, power of the people, power of the electorate. This is the 18th Amendment, another very important piece of progressive era legislation that is actually not in effect today, thankfully. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution began prohibition of alcohol in the U.S. Specifically, it banned the production, trafficking, and sale of alcohol that was not for medicinal or industrial purposes. And as I mentioned before, World War I did not stop the progressive era, did not stop the progressive movement. In some ways, it actually accelerated it. World War I, with resource shortages, a need to regulate the food system, it helped to facilitate the passage of the Volstead Act, which was the legislation that passed through Congress that eventually would become the 18th Amendment after it was ratified by the states. And Prohibition was an issue supported by many progressives, especially the women who were in the progressive movement. It was seen as a woman's issue, along with women gaining the right to vote, along with stopping gambling, stopping prostitution, and stopping human trafficking, particularly trafficking of girls and young women. Also, many of the more religious progressives supported prohibition. And when I say religious progressives, I primarily mean the Protestant progressives, Protestant religious progressives, because Catholics are not as supportive of prohibition. And in some ways, though, prohibition was also linked to xenophobia, the idea that non-native people, immigrants, they drank too much. Germans drank too much beer, Italians drank too much wine, Russians drank too much vodka. That this was going to assimilate and reform immigrants also does play into people's ideas about prohibition. And you certainly see this in World War I as well, because not only are there resource shortages in World War I, regulation of the food system, let's make bread instead of beer, but also there's a lot of anti-German sentiment and a lot of just general anti-immigrant sentiment in the World War I years. And the images on this slide are of 1920, so towards the end of the Progressive era, illegal, illicit alcohol being dumped into the sewer to dispose of it, while the police look on, and this is a image you see a lot online. I've seen it on pictures and cards. It's basically become a meme at this point. The slogan here, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours," this was a real slogan. It was from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. However, the image here of some older, rather grumpy-looking women who are actually rather shabbily dressed by the standards of the day. From my research, it's actually a still from a silent film that was actually meant to mock women who supported prohibition as being out of touch and wearing clothing that's out of style and just being um, um, unpleasant to be around, and that nobody who's watching this film actually wants to kiss any of these women. So of course they're going to say that they're opposed to alcohol. So it was actually, even in its own time, kind of a joke image. And this is the 19th Amendment, which was enacted in 1920, and it gave women the right to vote nationwide. And as was the case with the 18th Amendment, with alcohol prohibition, World War I did facilitate the passage of the 19th Amendment. But women had been gradually gaining the right to vote in the U.S., particularly in the western states. That way women could be counted towards the census requirement of 60,000 citizens in order for a territory to become a state. And it's also worth noting that the United States is expanding the right of women to vote at about the same time that the United Kingdom is as well, although the suffrage movement in Great Britain, I would say, was a more aggressive movement, in some cases a more violent movement as well, but that's a conversation for a British history course. And not all women, I should add, supported women's suffrage. Some felt that by gaining the right to vote, women would be trading their influence for a little bit of power, and that without having the right to vote, women could influence their husbands, their fathers, their sons to vote the way they wanted to, but as voters themselves, they would get to vote, and that would be all they would do, that basically women would replace activism and trying to win hearts and minds with just voting. They wouldn't do things like Mary Elizabeth Lease did back during the Populist years, for example. And other detractors suggested that issues that women cared about, things like alcohol prohibition, for example, yes, they might be able to vote on some of that stuff, but that these issues would become politicized because now major voting blocs cared about these issues. You might even see, instead of these issues being nonpartisan or even bipartisan, one party might support them more than another. And there was concern that this might lead to political polarization and that issues that women cared about might just stall out and not really go anywhere. And still others would suggest that yes, women might gain the right to vote, but now essentially they would be forced by their husbands or their fathers to vote the way the family patriarchs voted. So it really, we're not going to be extending women the right to vote in the truest sense. But again, this was a controversial issue at the time. And initially, women's voter participation was considerably lower than men's voter participation, although now, as of 25, in America, female voter participation is higher than male participation in voting, thanks to a variety of factors, including activism by women and women's voting groups like the League of Women Voters, for example. The progressives supported legislation, constitutional amendments to have income taxes, direct election of senators, prohibition of alcohol, voting rights for women. But they also supported journalism as a way to investigate social problems and advocate for change. This is where you have the work of people like Ida Tarbell, who I mentioned before, and Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle about problems with meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses and some of the health issues that were developing there. And the term muckraking, it actually comes from the Pilgrim's Progress, a 17th century English religious text. But it came into use again in the early 20th century to describe these journalists. Teddy Roosevelt used the term muckraking, and it wasn't actually a totally positive term. It meant you're digging down into the mess, the mud, and the corruption that was happening in turn of the century American society. And while the work you were doing was not unimportant, you were often missing the forest through the trees. So what were these muckraking journalists reporting on? Well, in Upton Sinclair's case, he was reporting on the really awful conditions in America's meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses, especially in Chicago, which was a major meatpacking town. It was also a major immigrant center and a rapidly growing city. And Upton Sinclair, he wrote a book called The Jungle, which came out in 1904 and would lead to the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. Sinclair's intention was not to inspire legislation that would regulate the meatpacking industry and regulate the food industry. He was much more concerned with working class people who were working in these very dirty and dangerous slaughterhouses, dealing with animals, cattle, steers, other animals that can be very dangerous as you're slaughtering them and then butchering them. You're exposed to chemicals. There's all kinds of pestilence and rats and things like that in these slaughterhouses that can really make them very dangerous places for the workers as well as for American consumers. But in the end, the work did more to regulate the food industry than it did to help the workers. Sinclair famously said, "I meant to hit them in their hearts, his readers. Instead, I hit them in their stomachs." The Pure Food and Drug Act would lead to other legislation that would regulate American food and American medicines. I mentioned some of this in a previous video when I talked about how Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it, and eventually it became illegal to have cocaine in Coca-Cola. So the Pure Food and Drug Act, it was designed to get rid of things like toothache drops with cocaine and alcohol. A lot of these medicines, they might make you feel good, but they wouldn't actually heal you or make you better. And the Pure Food and Drug Act targeted ingredients like these because it's very addicting and it doesn't actually deal with the root cause of your illness. It would also lead to the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, which regulated opium and cocaine. Basically, in order to get these opioids, you would have to get them from an actual prescription. You couldn't just go to the local drugstore or apothecary and just buy them on your own. You'd have to get those from an actual physician's prescription, again, to keep these drugs from just being consumed without physician oversight. In many ways, the war on drugs that we think of as being a late 20th century, early 21st century thing, it gets going in the Progressive era with things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Harrison Narcotics Act. The U.S. government is now going to try to regulate drugs and keep them out of the hands of people. And while they're trying to prevent addiction and get at the root causes of diseases, others would say that this is a form of government overreach. And I would also link the regulations on food and drugs to the Volstead Act, to prohibition as well. There's an attempt to keep alcohol from being consumed. Alcohol is not good for people. It is a depressant. The negative effects of alcohol were well known by the early 20th century. They hadn't always believed that alcohol was an unhealthy thing, but the evidence by the early 1900s was very clear that it was unhealthy and it was a depressant, and that people would be healthier if they didn't consume alcohol. But should it be the government's responsibility to keep people from consuming alcohol? That's what people will question. And they'll also question the effects of what happens when you criminalize certain substances. What will that mean for the people that consume those substances and for the people that produce and traffic them? But that's a subject we'll get to when we come to the 1920s in a future video. The Progressives were also opposed to child labor. The Progressives were generally pro-organized labor. They wanted working people to have more bargaining power, and by removing children from the labor force, this gives workers, adult workers, more of a opportunity to bargain because the labor force has been contracted. And also it means that children, instead of going to work in the factories, they can go to school instead. The Progressives were very pro-education. I have, however, argued that as America becomes more industrial, the economic value that children bring to a family decreases, and people begin to have fewer children. And this is a trend that will continue into the Progressive era. The Keating-Owing Act of 1916, though, specifically it forbade interstate trafficking of goods produced by children. This would not include agricultural products because children were involved in their families' household farm labor. They had for many years and would continue to do so after 1916. This is primarily designed to target factories and businesses that hire children as workers, as you can see in these images here. And working in these factories is very dangerous. Working in cotton mills, for example, there are cotton fibers that are in the air. They look a lot like snowflakes. It's very bad for your lungs, particularly young lungs, if you breathe those in. You can be injured, maimed in the factory, really before your adult life even begins. And so there's a push to regulate child labor and ultimately to make it unprofitable because you can't sell across state lines if you're producing goods using child labor. I'm going to shift gears now and talk about the politics of the Progressive era. I'll start by talking about the 1904 U.S. presidential election. In this election, Teddy Roosevelt, who was already president, he inherited the office after William McKinley was assassinated. He was the vice president, legally inherited the position after William McKinley was assassinated. He's going to run against Alton Parker, a New York Democrat, Roosevelt also being a New Yorker. But Parker was more of a conservative, more of a tight money Democrat, a lot like a Grover Cleveland, but he's a Northern Democrat. He's not a Southern Democrat. Remember, in this period, the Republican and Democratic parties, there's a big difference between a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. The parties are much more focused on local issues rather than they are on ideological or epistemological issues like they are today. But Roosevelt, he wins the popular vote very commandingly with 56.4% of the vote. He basically wins the entire country except for the solid South, as you can see on this map. Remember, the Democratic Party controls politics in the South. The South is essentially a single party region during this period. And Roosevelt had the wind at his back. He was the incumbent. He was also a hero of the Spanish-American War, and he supported progressive issues. Progressivism is the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time in 1904. So it really is no surprise that he wins in a landslide. I'll touch on Teddy Roosevelt's presidency as well. Some of the things he did in his first term after he took over for McKinley, but then things that he did after he actually won the 1904 election. He supported broadly what was something called the Square Deal, very similar language to FDR, who was actually his cousin, the New Deal of FDR, and it was a form of balanced progressivism. There were issues that were progressive that Teddy Roosevelt supported, but he supported progressivism in a very robust, very vitalistic way. It was the bully pulpit, it was called. He was a very active speaker and campaigner, and it was called the bully pulpit when he addressed people. He used to say, "Bully for you." Bully used to mean, it didn't mean a mean person. It meant someone who was vigorous and strong. And that's exactly how Teddy Roosevelt portrayed himself, and he brought a lot of vitalism to the presidency. He was a supporter of trust busting, breaking up monopolies, government regulation. He was a supporter of economic regulations through the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor. He was an avid conservationist, helping to found national parks at places like Crater Lake in Oregon and Pelican Island in Florida. On labor, he tried to take a balanced approach as well, but an approach that nonetheless strengthened the power of the U.S. government, particularly of the executive branch. In the fall of 1902, coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike. Coal miners would go on strike during the Gilded Age, and during the Progressive Era, they would strike for things like safer mining conditions. They would strike for different, better compensation forms. They wanted to be paid by the lighter U.S. ton rather than the heavier English ton, and they wanted to be able to hire their own weight checkers as well to make sure that they weren't getting ripped off by the mine operators, by management. But they went on strike in 1902. Winter is coming. There's concern about the cold. There not being enough coal to get the Americans through the winter, and when pressed about what to do about the situation in the oncoming winter, Roosevelt supposedly said, "To hell with the Constitution when the people want coal." He even talked about bringing in the U.S. Army to work the mines instead, basically bypassing both labor and management, having the government get more involved in the economy. In the end, this threat from the president, it led to negotiations, and the miners got some of the provisions they wanted, that they were striking for. And Teddy Roosevelt believed in something called the Stewart presidency. He believed in an active president, active executive branch that would be directly involved in what the Constitution would call promoting the general welfare. On other issues, like race, for example, Roosevelt did have some sympathy for African Americans and Native Americans, but on the whole, he was still an assimilationist. He wanted Native Americans to live more like white Americans, and while he did in some cases try to protect African American workers, particularly black civil service employees, the postmistress of Indianola, Mississippi, she was an African American woman, and when there were threats against her and her job, Roosevelt would shut down the Indianola post office. If you weren't going to work with an African American woman as the manager of the post office, you weren't going to get a post office. On other occasions, though, in 1906, there were African American soldiers in Texas who were accused of certain crimes. Roosevelt allowed them to be discharged from the army. So on race, he was, I would say, more progressive on race than other people at the time when it came to Native American issues, when it came to African American issues as well. He even invited Booker T. Washington to the White House Some of his stances on race would not be considered progressive today. Um, we'll talk more about Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, though, in a future lecture video. He was a supporter of U.S. imperialism, but we'll unpack that in the future. And the image on this slide is a famous story from Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. In 1902, he was on a hunting trip in Mississippi. He was brought a young bear to shoot. That way he could have a kill during his hunt. Teddy refused to do this because it wasn't good sportsmanship. Conservation and animal rights were emerging in America, and shooting a trapped animal kind of went against the hunter, sportsman, conservationist ethos that Teddy Roosevelt had created for himself. But the story was popular, it was humorous, and it led to toy companies selling what was called Teddy's Bear, or teddy bears. And they asked for the president's permission to name the bear after him, and he said, "Sure, if you think it's going to sell bears, you can do it." Progressivism is also advancing on the state and local levels during the Progressive era. And the best example of progressivism on the state level is Republican Governor of Wisconsin, Robert La Follette Sr.'s policies when he was governor from 1901 to 1906. And he supported these issues as well, even after he was no longer governor when he became senator. His progressive policies are often called a part of the Wisconsin idea. And the Wisconsin idea is part of Wisconsin culture. It involves education, regulations on big business to promote the general welfare in the state and to promote the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. Specifically, La Follette's policies include education, expanding the right to vote, expanding the franchise, support for muckraking journalists, breakup of big businesses, especially the railroad and logging businesses in the state, and then progressive tax plans, taxes that fall harder on the wealthy than they do on the middle and the working class, as well as things like price regulations for railroads. That was an old populist policy. And President Roosevelt was very impressed with what Governor La Follette was doing. He said that La Follette had turned Wisconsin into a laboratory for democracy. And many states implemented their own progressive reforms. Even southern states implemented some of these reforms, although southern states often used progressive language to justify things like the Jim Crow laws. And the image on this slide is La Follette giving a speech. In order to be a progressive leader, you had to be a good orator. Moving forward to the 1908 election, President Teddy Roosevelt declined to run for a second term because doing so would mean that he would end up being president for more than 8 years. Instead, his friend and protege, William Taft of Ohio, is going to be the Republicans' nominee for president. And Taft was a progressive conservative. That's often how he's described, as being a progressive conservative, meaning that he supports progressive policies, like the income tax, for example, but he also was seen as being a bit more pro-business than Teddy Roosevelt was, particularly when it came actually to foreign policy. But again, we're going to be talking about foreign policy during this period in a future video. But going into the election, he's running against William Jennings Bryan, who is at this point, a household name, a very well-known politician, and also a committed progressive as well. And to observers, it would have seemed that Bryan was going to win this election in the weeks and months leading up to the November election. In the end, though, it's a victory for Taft, and a very, very commanding one as well, in both the Electoral College and in the popular vote. Urban voters they do not like William Jennings Bryan. He's identified too much with his rural populist past, and they don't feel comfortable voting for him. And Taft and the Republicans do well with urban voters, and they do well with a lot of Western voters as well. Bryan gets the solid South, and he does get some of the Western states that used to vote for populists. But there's also some smaller parties that run as well, namely Eugene Debs and his Socialist Party. They're going to do even better in the 1912 election. But you see that socialists, they actually do pretty well in small local elections during this period. Many cities during this period have socialist mayors, even though the voters in these areas, they vote for one of the two main parties when it comes to a state or a federal election. So President Taft is identified as a progressive conservative, that he was less of a progressive than Teddy Roosevelt was. But is that really true? I don't think it's the whole story. Taft was an aggressive trust buster. By some estimates, he oversaw the breakup of more companies than Teddy Roosevelt did. In fact, the most famous trust-busting case in American history, the breakup of Standard Oil, it happens during the Taft presidency, not during the Roosevelt presidency. He supported other important progressive policies like civil service expansion. Remember, progressives wanted a lot of American governance to be handled not by politicians who were elected, but by unelected government agencies and bureaucrats and bureaucracies. And he was a supporter of the 16th and 17th Amendments as well. And actually, in terms of acreage, he conserved more land than Teddy Roosevelt did. Where he differs from Teddy Roosevelt and where he maybe loses some of his progressive bona fides is on foreign policy. He supported more of a financial American imperialism rather than a militaristic imperialism the way Teddy Roosevelt did. And linguistically speaking, Taft was not as openly antagonistic of big business as Teddy Roosevelt was. He certainly supported a lot of regulations on big business and trust busting, but he didn't attack them in his bully pulpit the way Teddy Roosevelt did. And I think also when people say that Taft was not as progressive as Teddy Roosevelt, they're often comparing the Teddy Roosevelt of the 1912 election to Taft, not the Teddy Roosevelt that ran in 1904 or was president from 1901 to 1909. So it may not be really a fair comparison to say that Taft was less of a progressive than Roosevelt. And lastly, I'll say that the personal style and approach of both of these men differed. Um, Taft was actually only 1 year older than Roosevelt, but if you look at the two of them in this picture, he looks like he could be 10 or 20 years older than Teddy Roosevelt. He's his hair is grayer, he's overweight, and he looks more like a Gilded Age president. You look at Taft, he looks more like a Grover Cleveland or a Chester Arthur. He doesn't seem like a modern president, or modern to the progressive era the way Teddy Roosevelt does. So it's his speaking style and it's his approach to politics, some of his foreign policy, but he doesn't come off as youthful and as vitalistic as Teddy Roosevelt, his predecessor, and one-time friend and ally, but future enemy. To further highlight some of the criticisms of Taft, that he was less of a progressive than Teddy Roosevelt, I want to highlight that one of the most successful labor strikes, labor disputes in American history took place during the Taft presidency. That's the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike of 1912. This was a strike of garment workers. They were advocating for better wages and a shorter workday, what they called bread and roses. Bread, they wanted good wages, that way they could provide food for their families, and roses, they wanted to live a comfortable and dignified life as working people, and they could achieve that by a shorter workday. They were organized by the Wobblies, or the International Workers of the World. The IWW, or the Wobblies, remember, they were a more radical union that was more socialistic. And the working people on strike were harassed by management and by the police of Lawrence, Massachusetts. Eventually it got so bad that the workers sent their children out of the city so that they could be safer. But as the children were sent out of the city, the children themselves were harassed by the police, which was not a good look. And President Taft supported the strikers, and the strike got national attention, and they had their demands met. It was one of the most successful strikes in American history, and Taft was a supporter. rather than sending in the army to make the factories run the way Teddy Roosevelt might have, Taft gave support to the striking workers. There were also coal strikes during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. There's going to be coal strikes actually during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, his successor, just as there were strikes for coal-related issues in 1902 during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And the strikes that occurred during the Taft presidency are the 1912 to 1913 Paint Creek strikes and the Cabin Creek strikes in West Virginia. And these strikes were less successful than the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike. These strikes saw 50-plus deaths, and the strikers really only had mixed results. An important leader for these strikes was a woman named Mary Harris Jones, who was known to people at the time as Mother Jones. There's actually a left-leaning media organization called Mother Jones nowadays. But what Mother Jones did was she led what were called umbrella marches that included women who were related to the strike, the wives, the mothers, the daughters of the strikers. And they carried umbrellas to symbolize that they were on strike, that they needed protection, but they also carried umbrellas because umbrellas were often a symbol of social safety nets, something that many working people as well as progressive leaders supported during this period. Initially, Mother Jones was arrested, and she was actually going to be put on trial by a military court where she would be much more likely to be found guilty than a jury of her peers. In the end, though, under pressure from Governor William Hatfield, yes, that Hatfield from the Hatfield and McCoy's feud in the 1800s. Governor Hatfield saw to it that she was released and that the strikes would come to an end and that there would not be a really brutal suppression of the strike leaders. So this was a strike with more mixed results than the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike. And this is the Colorado Coalfield War. This saw the Ludlow Massacre of April 20th, 1914. Coal strikers in Colorado were on strike as well, and they were suppressed by the Colorado National Guard and by private strikebreakers that were brought in by the mine operators. In some cases, the private strikebreakers would actually wear military uniforms to look like the National Guard to give them legitimacy, but the strikers attempted to derail trains that were being used by the strikebreakers, and the strikebreakers and the National Guard were even using things like armored cars to attack the strikers' camps. In the end, the strikebreakers set fire to the Ludlow mining camp because the strikers had been forced out of the company town during the strike, and their camp was destroyed, and many strikers and even some of their families perished in this fire. And this strike took place during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who at this point in his presidency was very sympathetic towards striking workers. And the mines that actually were seeing these strikes, they were managed by John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of John Rockefeller of Standard Oil. This is the last presidential election I'll talk about in this video, and this is the 1912 election. Again, I believe the progressive era actually goes as late as 1920, but I'm going to discuss the 1916 and 1920 elections in future videos. Taft is the incumbent Republican. He's going to run against Woodrow Wilson of the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson was a college professor actually at Princeton University. He studied political science and history, and eventually he got into politics and then ran for president as a Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt disagreed with William Taft about which areas ought to be conserved. They also disagreed about foreign policy, and for this and other reasons, Teddy Roosevelt tried to actually become the Republican Party's nominee, but was rejected by the party elites in favor of Taft, who was already president. Instead, Teddy Roosevelt will go on to found the Progressive Party. You can see it here in green. Green is often a color associated with progressivism in America. The party was called the Bull Moose Party because the story was after being basically kicked out of the Republican Party, they asked Teddy Roosevelt how he felt about it. He said, "I feel like a bull moose." And the Progressive Party was dedicated to many different progressive issues. They had a set of policies that were called New Nationalism, and there was a nationalistic element to the Progressive Bull Moose Party. There was a almost a militarism about them, but they also supported many progressive issues as well. And there were clear religious and militaristic overtones in the Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party's language and how they explain their agendas. For the Democratic Party, Woodrow Wilson, his agenda, his policy agenda, was called New Freedom, and it was seen as being a bit more individualistic and you might say libertarian than Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism was, or the policies of the incumbent um, William Taft. He was also very focused on anti-corruption as well. Um, And I think some of the rhetoric about Taft not being as progressive as Teddy Roosevelt, it comes from the 1912 presidential election. That if you're a disaffected progressive Republican voter, you shouldn't vote for Taft. You should vote instead for Teddy Roosevelt, who used to be a Republican, but now is a third-party candidate. In this election, Eugene Debs runs as a third party, or really as a fourth party in this case. And Debs criticized all of the major candidates, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft, but he criticized Teddy Roosevelt the most because he felt that Teddy Roosevelt sounded the most progressive, but that by sounding the most progressive, he was going to mislead American voters and prevent the spread of socialism in the country. In the end, though, as you can see from the election returns, it's a massive victory for Woodrow Wilson in the Electoral College. He doesn't win the majority of the popular vote. He only wins the plurality, meaning that he was the most popular candidate. He did not have more than 50% of the vote. And really, the Republican vote and the Progressive Party vote, had those votes come together, they could have defeated Woodrow Wilson. It's just both Taft and Roosevelt wanted to run for president or run for re-election. And by both running, they essentially gave away the election to the Democratic Party and to Woodrow Wilson. During the 1912 election, former president running again, Teddy Roosevelt, survived an assassination attempt. He was preparing to deliver a speech when a angry anarchist attempted to assassinate the president. He was shot in the chest, but his thick copy of his speech, it was over 50 pages long, it stopped the bullet. And Roosevelt saw what happened, and he concluded that he hadn't been shot through the lung, and so he decided to continue on with his speech plans. And the first thing he said was, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." So presidential assassinations, attempted assassinations of presidential candidates, we see these things in 1912, and we see them much more recently as well. These are some of the policies that Woodrow Wilson focused on as President of the United States. Tariff reform, minimizing tariffs, that was a long-standing Democratic Party policy, really going back to the founding of the party in the era of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. And the idea now was these tariffs are not needed because we have income tax now to fund the U.S. government, and tariffs are just going to make consumer goods more expensive, which is going to hurt everyday Americans. So tariffs should be reformed. Wilson is going to support antitrust legislation. He wants to regulate big business. And to that end, the FTC is going to be founded during his presidency in 1914. Wilson is also going to help implement the 16th and 17th Amendments. most of the work to get those amendments drafted and put together and then passed and ratified was done by his predecessors, Teddy Roosevelt and William Taft, but Wilson is the one who's going to be president when they're fully implemented. So in the popular memory, Woodrow Wilson is often associated with the 16th and 17th Amendments, especially I found the 16th Amendment. And he was a supporter of workers' rights, shorter working hours, and limiting child labor, key progressive legislation. He was, early in his presidency, more on the side of workers and on the side of labor than he was on the side of business. Now, things will change during the World War I years, but that's going to be a discussion for our World War I video. He also will nominate the first Jewish Supreme Court justice as well, and culturally speaking, Woodrow Wilson is an interesting figure. Textbooks that I've used in the past have referred to Woodrow Wilson as the progressive president, more so than Teddy Roosevelt, more so than William Taft. And I think they do this because in many ways he was the most culturally progressive of all of them. He fit the mold of the progressive activist and reformer more so than William Taft, who was seen as being too friendly with business, or Teddy Roosevelt, who, although he was very supportive of progressivism, he was from the upper class. The Roosevelt family was old money. Wilson, however, was from a more middle class background. His father was a minister. He was from Virginia. He eventually became a college professor. He was very much an educated intellectual. And so in many ways, he kind of fits the mold of the progressive a bit more. However, there's many things that Wilson will support that are not very progressive. His stance on race, he was openly antagonistic to African Americans in a way that Taft and Roosevelt were not. He oversees the resegregation of U.S. Government agencies, of the White House, and he'll even oversee the mass dismissal of African American government employees. Teddy Roosevelt was trying to protect African American government employees' jobs. Wilson was trying to sack them from their positions. And he generally had, I would argue, the most racist attitude towards African Americans of the three progressive presidents. Again, in this period, one could, believe it or not, be a progressive and a supporter of segregation. Again, because progressivism in the turn of the century was such a broad movement. Woodrow Wilson even did things like screening Birth of a Nation, a 1915 pro-KKK film at the White House, and then he said it was a great movie. He said it was all true. And he's a historian and political science professor, and he's saying something like this. So for many years, Woodrow Wilson was seen as being one of the great American presidents. He was liked by both conservative and liberal scholars because of his leadership during World War I, because of the progressive legislation that he supported, because of his educational background. But in recent years, I've found that scholars from both a liberal and a conservative perspective have really turned on Woodrow Wilson. Progressives and liberal historians don't like him for his stances on race. They feel that he was too pro-big business, especially during the World War I years, that he was anti-worker, especially during the World War I years. And conservative historians criticize him for growing the size of the U.S. government, for taking the wrong stance on World War I, and then even for his views on race as well. So he's a political figure that has gone from being generally well respected, even loved across the aisle, to being very, very criticized in recent years from many different perspectives. Conclusion. The progressive era from the turn of the century till about 1920 was a dynamic time of American political change and economic change, and there were many antecedents to progressivism. There were the Georgists, there were the Bellamy clubs, and there were the Populists, who go on to inspire the progressive era that happens at the turn of the century. And the progressives were looking to fix social problems that had emerged during the Gilded Age as a result of industrialization and urbanization and population growth, and they wanted to use education, both their own educational training and educational systems, to fix these problems, to help working class people, to assimilate immigrants, and to make America a more democratic society and a more equal society, a society where capitalism would be saved from itself. And they had a complex relationship with democracy. In many ways, they supported democracy. They enlarged the franchise by extending the right to vote to women and by allowing Americans to vote on more things, namely direct elections of senators with the 17th Amendment. At the same time, they did have some concerns about democracy as well, and so they supported a lot of expansions to the American administrative state. Governance will be handled by unelected bureaucrats in many cases, thanks to the progressive movement. And they are a big tent movement. There are Democrats and Republicans, women and men, white people, black people, religious people, and secular people. There's politicians, and then there's educators, doctors, and really professionals, and professionalism is the thread that brings them all together. These are people that have educational training of some kind, and they want to fix social problems. That's the class of people that they are. And progressivism is the cultural zeitgeist. It's the dominant force in American politics and culture from about the turn of the century through the World War I years till about the 1920s and the beginning of the 1920s. It's definitely the end of progressivism. But we're going to talk about why progressivism comes to an end in future lectures. While the progressive movement does come to an end, much of their legislation, their creation of those government agencies, government bureaus like the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce, they're still in effect today. Antitrust legislation is still in effect today, although some might say it's not enforced in the same way that it was in the past. But then things like the 16th Amendment with income taxes, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, the 19th Amendment, women having the right to vote, that's important progressive legislation that is still in effect today.